U.S. Navy warship, targeted by Venezuelan F-16s. Then this happened. U.S. Navy, November 15, 2025. Darkness still blanketed the Caribbean Sea when the radar aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford suddenly lit up. A pair of faint, fast, low-flying contacts were approaching from the southwest. They were Venezuelan F-16A Block 15s, Cold War-era fighters flying just 120 feet above the water. Caracas had ordered them to do one thing: locate and intimidate a U.S. destroyer supposedly drifting in disputed waters. But what they found was not a destroyer. It was CVN-78, the most advanced aircraft carrier on Earth. Without warning, one of the Venezuelan jets fired a burst of 34 tracer rounds, stitching the sea only inches from the hull of the American carrier. It was an act of escalation that triggered every sensor and weapon system inside Carrier Strike Group 2. Instantly, the United States launched two FA-18E Super Hornets, roaring into the fight. Would Venezuela's outdated F-16s have any chance of piercing the steel defenses of America's most advanced warship? Or would that reckless strike ignite a swift and devastating U.S. counterattack? Let's uncover the truth. Hour 12 a.m. November 15th, 2025, on the runway of El Libertador Air Base, two Venezuelan F-16A Fighting Falcons, nearly 40-year-old airframes, trembled under the pressure of their roaring engines. Despite their age, each jet had cost the Venezuelan government over $22 million in maintenance and upgrades, and each could climb from 0 to 28,000 feet, about 8,160 meters, in under 3 minutes. Tonight, they were not performing a training mission. They were flying blindly into a mistake. According to the command brief, their target was a small American destroyer codenamed Echo 7, roughly 9,000 tons, supposedly operating in disputed waters. But the intelligence packet had been transmitted 18 hours earlier, an eternity at sea. No one mentioned that a U.S. carrier strike group could shift 30 to 45 nautical miles overnight, completely rewriting the tactical map. At 4:19, Captain Luis Herrera and Lieutenant Carlos Mejia took off, their F-16s consuming 22,000 pounds of fuel per hour as they accelerated east. They dropped to 160 feet above the Caribbean Sea, an altitude where a single wave could slap the underside of the aircraft in 0.3 seconds, but low-altitude flight meant staying beneath the reach of long-range radar. At least, that was the plan. For the first 20 miles, everything looked normal, calm sea. Clean scope, no American reaction. Then, at 37 nautical miles, Mejia's AN/APG-66 radar began to pick up the impossible. A return 12 times larger than a destroyer. A thermal signature stretching nearly 330 meters. A moving mass equivalent to 100,000 tons of steel. "Luis, that's not Echo 7, he said, voice tightening. The silhouette in their sights was not a destroyer. It was the USS Gerald R. Hoard, CVN-78, a U.S. nuclear-powered supercarrier hauling roughly 70 strike aircraft, shielded by 6 escort warships, and capable of erasing any threat in under 15 seconds. And 2 aging Venezuelan F-16s were flying straight into it. Just as the Venezuelan F-16s dropped to 120 feet above the waves, the entire battlefield snapped into focus. Captain Herrera's AN/APG-66 radar, built in the 1980s, struggled to process the returning echoes. Instead of a compact 9,000-ton destroyer, his scope now displayed a radar cross-section the size of an 18-story building laid on its side. A steel mass over 330 millimeters long, so massive The display nearly spilled outside its frame, but Herrera had no time to question it. Caracas wanted footage a close pass, a warning run, something bold enough for morning television. So he pushed the throttle forward. The F-16 surged to 510 knots, its Pratt & Whitney engine roaring with 14,900 pound-feet of thrust. The jet skimmed through the humid Caribbean air, low enough for sea spray to kiss the landing gear doors. At 5:05 a.m., Herrera squeezed the trigger for exactly 1.2 seconds, spraying 34 tracer rounds into the water. Just ahead of the carrier's bow, a short burst, just intimidation. On the American side, the reaction was immediate. By 5:10 p.m., every ship in Carrier Strike Group 2 had registered the maneuver. Alarms erupted across the formation. Missile doors opened. Weapons officers ran to their stations. The USS Gridley went into full combat escalation. Rayam-116 ram launchers rotated, tracking the V-shaped flight path of the Venezuelan jet. The Phalanx CIWS, capable of firing up to 4,500 rounds per minute, spun up, barrels beginning to glow in the pre-dawn dark. The SPY-1D radar picture tightened around the two F-16s with such precision that operators could see micro-movements in the aircraft's wings. Above, two F/A-18E Super Hornets had already launched, dropping from 5,000 feet to intercept. The Super Hornets rolled inverted, diving at Mach 0.95, locking onto both F-16s from roughly 1.9 miles away, a distance at which a missile would need only 6 seconds to hit. Herrera saw the lock, heard the warning tone, felt the cockpit tremble as American fire control radars painted his jet. He realized too late that Echo 7 had never been a lone destroyer. He had just fired a warning burst at a $7.5 billion nuclear aircraft carrier protected by enough firepower to erase his jet before he could even blink. The sky tightened. Every radar screamed. Every trigger finger hovered. One more second, one more spark, and the Caribbean would erupt into war. The Caribbean sky shifted from darkness to steel gray as the two FA-18E Super Hornets dropped to low altitude. The distance between them and the two Venezuelan F-16s had shrunk to just over 2 miles. Far too close for error. From the Ford's flight deck, the air control team confirmed hostile jets descending to 100 feet. Rules of engagement shifted. Stand by for counterforce. Each Super Hornet carried 4 AIM-120D AMRAAMs, 2 AIM-9X, and an ASQ-228 targeting system. Each could lock onto a target at over 160 kilometers, but today they did not need range. They needed pressure, forcing the Venezuelans to back off or slip up below. Herrera felt the airframe shake harder by the minute. The F-16's radar warning receiver emitted a long, sharp, piercing tone. The United States was locking on. Red lights flashed high priority threat. 3 o'clock, missile lock. The Americans did not fire, but they tightened the angles. The two Super Hornets inverted at about 5,100 feet, then dove at Mach 4.96, generating enough compression to throw the Venezuelan sensors off by a fraction of a degree. A tiny number, but enough to break the weak lock of the F-16s. USS Gridley and USS John Finn shifted to combat level 3. Ram launchers rotated a full 300 degrees, locking firmly onto both F-16s. One wrong move, even an accidental turn toward the carrier, and Ram could launch in seconds, with missiles arriving in 4 to 5 seconds. The entire carrier group switched to cooperative engagement capability. 6 ships, 28 radars, 42 antennas. 1 shared combat, brain processing 1.8 million signals per second. It left the two F-16s exposed and naked over the sea, Super Hornet 204 locked onto Mejia's F-16 from roughly 1.6 miles. At that range, if the U.S. pulled the trigger, an AIM-9X would reach its target in under 4 seconds. Inside the F-16 cockpit, the air thickened. Herrera shouted over the radio, "Carlos, brake left, now!" But the Americans had already cut off the escape path. Super Hornet 211 dove in from the right, forming a tightening pincer. The Pentagon transmitted a command code to USS Gridley. DEFCON Air Level 2. Non-lethal dominance authorized. It meant the U.S. would not fire first, but would crush the opponent's options, forcing an unconditional retreat. USS Gridley launched 2 MiG-58 Marquis marker flares, creating a 900-millimeter column of fire, a burning line across the Caribbean. One more nautical mile across that line, and this would become war. The 2 Super Hornets screamed past the noses of the F-16s at a distance of roughly 190 meters, so close that a deviation of just 3 degrees would have caused a mid-air collision. Wind roared against the canopy like tearing metal. Radar lock tones blared non-stop, and the Venezuelan pilots finally understood they were no longer the hunters. They were prey, surrounded by the steel predators of the United States Navy. The Caribbean sky then cracked open with a long metallic shriek as the patience of the U.S. Navy reached its limit. After nearly 18 minutes of non-lethal suppression, the 2 F-16s still held their course, still trying to maintain a no-retreat posture to report back to Caracas. But in warfare, a single millisecond can change everything. From the deck of USS Gridley, the RIM 166B RAM system received its first command of the morning. Weapons hot. Tracking F-16 number 1. The sensors slewed 72 degrees left, hard locking onto Herrera's jet. Less than 0.6 seconds later, a compact RAM missile launched at roughly Mach 2.4, tearing through the air like a blade. Herrera heard only one sound. Missile inbound. 2 seconds to impact. 2 seconds. No time to think. No time to pray. He yanked the control stick. The F-16 rolled 74 degrees left, pulling G-forces that nearly exceeded the wing structure limits. The white exhaust plume from the RAM missile grazed past only about 41 millimeters from the cockpit, close enough to strip paint from the right wing. But today, the United States was not going to rely on near misses. The 2 Super Hornets, already in perfect encirclement, shifted from warning to combat termination. The pilot of aircraft 211 dropped to about 310 feet, locking onto Mejia's F-16 at roughly 1.4 miles. On the HUD, the indicator was clear: AIM-9X, 98% probability of kill. Mejia knew exactly what that meant. He had trained with the AIM-9X since academy days, and he had never seen it miss at under 2 miles. Super Hornet 211 fired. A white spear of light shot forward, leaving the launch rail at over 1,600 kilometers, then accelerating to around Mach 2 in just over a second. It locked onto the target via its infrared seeker, following the heat of the F-16's engine, the only hot object against the cool blue sea. Mejia attempted an escape maneuver, a split S-dive toward the surface, but the F-16 was a 1980s design. Its control system responded slower than that of a Super Hornet. He could not outrun fate. The AIM-9X hit at roughly 27 millimeters above the waves, detonating with the force of about 9 kilos of PBX-112 explosive. Fire ballooned into a sphere, slicing the F-16 in half like a hot blade through foil. Mejia's biometric signal vanished from the CEC network in 0.04 seconds. Herrera saw only a flash, then a column of black smoke. Inside, the remaining F-16 oxygen levels dropped as backup systems overloaded. Herrera screamed, his voice shaking. "I'm hit! Carlos is gone! I'm disengaging! disengaging. But the United States does not simply stop once a hostile platform has demonstrated a willingness to fire on a carrier. That is the rule of close-range carrier warfare. The threat must be neutralized completely. The two Super Hornets banked, reacquiring Herrera at just under 2 miles with a projected missile time to impact of 6 seconds. The explosion of Mejia's F-16 was still echoing across the water when every sensor in Carrier Strike Group 2 simultaneously switched to remaining high-risk target. Herrera, the last F-16 pilot, banked hard and tried climbing to 600 feet, but the F-100 PW-200 engine was overheating after the high-intensity maneuvers. The OVHT warning light blinked like a failing heartbeat. Over the radio, his voice cracked. "This is Falcon 2. I'm disengaging. I repeat, I am disengaging." The Americans did not answer. Not because they did not hear him, but because every combat subsystem had entered an automatic kill priority mode if the target showed any climb, acceleration, or heading change back toward the group. On USS Gridley, the SPY-1D fire control solution built a glowing red data mesh around the F-16. Radar precision at that moment reached roughly 0.004 degrees, equivalent to tracking a metal coin from over 20 kilometers away. This was no longer monitoring. This was a countdown to elimination. The two Super Hornets tightened their circle. Distance 1.8 miles, 1.7, 1.6. On the American pilot's HUD, the line appeared AIM 120D, time to impact 6 seconds. 6 seconds to decide between peace and war. Inside the Gerald R. Ford's combat room, Captain Mark Dalton watched every parameter Herrera's speed, altitude, flight angle. Any deviation beyond plus or minus 9 degrees was classified as a pre-attack maneuver. Any acceleration above 0.3 g was defined as an immediate threat. On the main CIC screen, the F-16 icon flickered yellow, then red. It was accelerating. Not much, only 11 knots. But for the automatic threat identification system, that was enough to trigger a Level 1 missile launch condition. 2 weapons officers called out in unison. "Target escalating. Request permission to fire." No one in the CIC said another word. The entire 333-member ship sank into silence, like a steel monument, awaiting judgment. In the cockpit of Super Hornet 211, the pilot felt the tension in the control stick ease as the auto-fire system prepared to take over. The armed light went solid. Target lock shifted to solid red. In Herrera's F-16, a single sound filled the cockpit: missile alert. Terminal phase inbound. He understood. This was the final warning before everything turned to metallic dust. He screamed into the radio, his voice cracking like shattered glass. "I'm breaking off. No weapons, no weapons. I'm climbing out of the zone." He pulled the stick, pushed the F-16 up to about 1/200 foot, shut down all radar and targeting emissions, and dropped speed to 290 knots, dangerously low for a fighter. In the CIC, the red icon shifted to orange, then blue. The American pilot exhaled. The auto-launch sequence for the AIM 120D froze at 3 seconds. A regional war had just been avoided because one pilot chose to let go of the trigger. The Super Hornets drifted to both sides, escorting the Venezuelan pilot out of the carrier's security bubble at a monitoring distance of roughly 2.4 miles. No one spoke. No one smiled. That silence, sometimes, is the victory. On a morning when death was only 3 seconds away, silence was worth more than any kill. The sun had barely lifted above the Caribbean when the first political shockwave detonated. As the surviving Venezuelan F-16 limped westward under American escort, encrypted channels across the region crackled awake. Bogota, Brasilia, Havana, Washington. Every capital understood instantly that something had gone catastrophically wrong at sea. By 5:40 a.m., USS Gerald R. Ford had already uploaded the initial CEC combat log, 19.2 GB of radar tracks, thermal trails, weapon system triggers, and cockpit audio. Within minutes, it reached the Pentagon and the White House Situation Room. Analysts did not even need to zoom in. The data told a brutally simple truth. The Venezuelan jets had fired first, descended to strike altitude, and refused all radio warnings. In Caracas, the truth was treated like an intruder. At 6:10 a.m., President Arsenio Navarro appeared on national television, his voice controlled but trembling beneath the surface. 2 of our brave pilots were attacked without provocation by an American carrier. We demand international condemnation. Venezuela will not be intimidated. 2 words sent the region spiraling: attacked and provocation. The surviving pilot, Herrera, was still airborne when he heard it. His breathing quickened. The narrative was being forged before he even touched the ground. By 6:15 a.m., Colombia issued the first emergency advisory, placing its northern radar network on alert level Bravo. Brazil followed at 6:22. The Dominican Republic and Trinidad locked down civilian air corridors. For the first time in 17 years, the Caribbean basin saw simultaneous activation of 3 overlapping early warning grids. A defensive posture used only when nations fear a cascading regional conflict. The CIA station in Bogota transmitted a rapid assessment probability of Venezuelan military escalation within 72 hours. 54%? Too high. Far too high. The Pentagon convened an emergency joint threat board at 7:20 a.m. The first presentation was a frame-by-frame reconstruction. The room fell silent as analysts displayed the exact moment Mejia's F-16 fired its 1.2-second burst and the precise timestamps showing Ram's near strike at 5:19:24. Then came the most dangerous slide, projected Venezuelan public reaction. The model predicted violent protests, military mobilization, and domestic pressure that could push Caracas toward retaliation, rational or not. Meanwhile, the White House crafted an official statement. Word choice became a battlefield. One wrong verb could ignite the hemisphere. One misplaced adjective could embarrass an ally. One sentence could force war planners to rewrite the next 6 months. By 8:00 a.m., the global news cycle exploded. U.S. shoots down Venezuelan fighter jet. Dog fight over the Caribbean. American carrier provokes incident. Headlines raced ahead of facts. By 9:30 a.m., the crisis reached the United Nations. U.S. Ambassador Catherine Riley walked into the chamber with a black case the size of a small projector. Inside it, classified, timestamp synchronized CEC telemetry. Declassified for 1 day only, Venezuela's ambassador, Sebastián Rojas, arrived moments later. His speech was already being broadcast across Spanish-language networks. The narrative was simple. America had attacked 2 unarmed pilots on patrol. The U.S. delegation came with something else data. At 10:14 a.m., the meeting opened. Venezuela spoke first. Rojas raised his voice, pointing dramatically as cameras flashed. Our pilots followed international air protocols. The United States violated sovereignty, international law, and the safety of neutral airspace. Several non-aligned nations nodded. Then Ambassador Riley pressed a button. The lights dimmed. CEC system logs filled the screens, frame by frame. Radar tracks materialized the altitude drops, the 1.2-second burst, the pincer formation of Super Hornets, the 900 mm 58 warning line, the red escalation flag triggered at plus 11 knots. Then came the cockpit audio that sealed the room's silence. I'm hit, Carlos is gone. I'm disengaging. Disengaging. Everyone understood what that meant. He was fleeing, not attacking. Riley spoke only 13 words. These are not opinions. These are machine-verified combat records. The effect was immediate. Notes were scribbled. Defense attachés whispered into secure phones. Infrared footage of Mejia's F-16 firing its warning burst at 5:05 p.m. left 18 ambassadors frozen. One visibly gasped. The Venezuelan claim collapsed under thermographic evidence. Yet the U.S. did not seek humiliation, only prevention. Riley ended with a line that would be quoted for years. War is often born from minutes of confusion and days of pride. We ask this body to choose clarity over pride. The UN did not condemn Venezuela, but it did not condemn the U.S. either. Instead, it issued a dual censure warning that escalating military miscalculations in the Caribbean posed a threat to regional stability. Diplomacy had bought time, but not safety. While the world debated in New York, Venezuela burned politically. When Herrera landed at 11:32 a.m., ground crews filmed his F-16 from multiple angles, panels scorched, intake vents charred, oxygen lines ruptured. Every image contradicted the official government narrative. But the regime needed a hero and a story. By noon, state-controlled media declared Herrera a defender of sovereignty while quietly erasing every technical detail. Then came the unexpected blow. At 12:40 p.m. Center leaked footage from naval radar stations showed that Venezuelan command had been using 18-hour-old intelligence, a fatal negligence in maritime warfare. The footage went viral. Military bloggers, opposition figures, even former generals attacked the government online. They sent pilots into a trap with outdated data. This was not bravery. This was incompetence. Families of active-duty airmen began protesting outside Fuerte Tiuna. Inside the Air Force High Command, fractures deepened. Some generals demanded confrontation with the U.S. to restore honor. Others warned that a full-scale war would end in national ruin within days. By 2:00 p.m., President Navarro convened his Security Council. The leaked transcript later summarized his dilemma in a single line. We cannot appear weak. We cannot fight a carrier group. We cannot admit fault. We cannot survive the truth. Meanwhile, the United States Navy released high-definition overlays showing how close the region came to catastrophe. One screenshot highlighting the 3-second window between peace and war. The map stunned militaries worldwide. By evening, the political ground under Caracas was splitting. The Air Force blamed naval intelligence. Naval intelligence blamed the Defense Ministry. The Defense Ministry blamed foreign manipulation. Citizens blamed everyone. And in the middle of it all sat the image that defined the crisis, the lone F-16 climbing to safety at 290 knots. Surrender lights on, chased not by missiles, but by 2 American Super Hornets, ensuring he survived the escort. For many Venezuelans, this was not humiliation. It was a reminder that war nearly took their sons. When the last Venezuelan F-16 vanished beyond the edge of the carrier group's sensor range, the Caribbean finally exhaled. The sea looked calm again, the horizon soft under the first hints of daylight. But everyone inside Carrier Strike Group 2 knew the truth. They had just survived the kind of morning that entire regions are lost to. Nothing in the gentle waves revealed how close the hemisphere had come to a firestorm. But in the minds of the sailors who watched red threat indicators flare across their screens, or the pilots who heard missile tones in their headsets, one fact echoed like a heartbeat. War had stopped with only 3 seconds to spare. For the United States Navy, the morning became a testament to a different kind of power, the kind that holds rather than strikes. Every system, from RAM to CEC to the Super Hornets tightening their pincer, proved decisive dominance. They had complete control of the battle space. They could have fired with zero doubt about the outcome. Yet the greatest demonstration of strength they gave the world was restraint. They chose clarity over anger, precision over pride, and stability over the easy temptation of overwhelming force. On the other side of the sky, Captain Luis Herrera faced the most human moment of the entire crisis. His jet was failing. His oxygen was dropping. His sensors were dying one by one. But he made the choice that saved thousands of lives across a dozen cities. He disengaged. No bravado, no last gesture, no political theater, just a pilot who realized that surviving, not escalating, was the only sane path left. His final climb to 200 feet, his shutdown of emitters, his desperate drop to 290 knots, these were not signs of defeat. They were signs of clarity. Hours later, diplomats would argue, governments would spin narratives, headlines would ignite across continents, but none of the political noise changed the truth written in radar tracks and cockpit audio. The world narrowly avoided a war triggered by outdated intelligence, mistaken assumptions, and human pressure inside 2 cramped cockpits. It was not technology alone that prevented catastrophe. It was not doctrine. It was not the United Nations. It was people, American and Venezuelan, who chose not to let one mistake define the fate of millions. In the end, the most powerful moment of the entire crisis came not from missiles or machines, but from silence. The silence of the AIM 120D countdown freezing at 3 seconds, the silence of 2 Super Hornets easing into escort formation instead of attack formation, the silence of a damaged F-16 retreating toward safety instead of disaster. That silence became the victory, quiet, fragile, and far more valuable than any explosion. History will remember this morning not for how close it came to war, but for how deliberately it stepped back from the edge. And in that small, vanishing space, where restraint defeated pride, the Caribbean kept its sunrise,